The Steady State Sentinels, produced by the Steady State, a community of former national security professionals who spent their careers safeguarding the United States, at home and abroad.
Today, we continue that mission by staying true to our oaths to defend the Constitution,
uphold our democracy,
and protect our nation's security. Join our expert hosts as they interview field-tested guests whose unique experiences shed light on the crises and challenges facing our nation.
welcome to the show. I'm John Seifer, and this is the Steady State Sentinel. Today, we're honored to be joined by Lieutenant General retired Ben Hodges, who's here with us from Germany. General Hodges is the former commanding general of U.S. Army Europe, senior military strategist, and one of the most respected voices on NATO, Russia, and the future of European security. So, General Hodges, thanks so much for being here.
John, thanks very much for the privilege.
Well, let's just talk a little bit about you. I mean, the idea of the Steady State is to discuss the professionalism of national security professionals, public servants in this day and age where everything seems to be politicized. So I just want to talk a little bit about your background, how you got into it, what's your view in terms of, country over party, those type of things. So if that's all right with you.
Yeah, sure. I'm from North Florida originally, near Tallahassee. Grew up in a small town, and I did not come from a military family, but almost all the men in my family had served at some point, either as a draftee or volunteer. The vast majority of them did their part, and so it was always an assumption that I would do something. And I really wanted to be in the Army, and I'm 67 years old, so I'm in high school. Junior high and high school during most of Vietnam. And I watched the news every night. You see the soldiers out there, and I'm not fully appreciating how terrible it was for them. And I thought, man, that is so cool. I want to do that. I want to be a leader of soldiers. And so that was my ambition. I ended up going to West Point, graduated in 1980, which means I started in the summer of 76. And summer of 76, of course, is I know you were probably not even born then, but
well, I got a commission to go to West Point. I would have been graduating class of 83, and I went there. I was going to play football and lacrosse, and I went and stayed with some generals that lived on base and everything. And they went to the officers club on Sunday, and I ate and drank so much like pastries and things, I threw up in the bathroom. It was a crazy time. But the notion of making my bed every day, my parents were like sort of hippie-ish professors. And so like I'd never made my bed, and it was just a little step too far. Like I loved West Point. It's a beautiful place. I would have been proud to go there.
You can be sure I was in the bottom quartile of the people that entered with my class. But the reason I bring this up is because, that was 1976. Vietnam, My Lai is right behind us. I mean, it's still fresh. All of the faculty were Vietnam veterans. And so it was pounded into our head from the very beginning about, your oath to the Constitution, that the military was apolitical, and that the respect, of course, we wanted to regain respect to the American population after Vietnam. Because the military, the reason I got into West Point, because nobody wanted to send their kid to West Point, in the 70s. So I just remember being immersed in this, the importance of the Constitution, of earning and retaining the respect of our fellow citizens. And that meant, of course, operating within a legal framework, and the whole emphasis on integrity, duty, honor, country, all of that. I mean, from the minute you walk through that gate, it's pounded into you. And I vividly remember sitting in class, a law class, law of armed conflict, and they're talking about My Lai and the massacre, and how did this happen? And the U.S. Army would kill innocent civilians, and this notion or responsibility of disobeying orders that were unlawful, having the courage to say, no, we're not going to do this. and to prevent others from doing it. And then so that was from the very beginning. That was at my core as an officer. It was impressing me how important this was.
And so, as you started your career when you were young, I mean, your sort of views that you now speak on leadership, military professionalism, what were some of the key experiences early in your career that helped shape that, the things you had to face, or were there mentors and leaders that really influenced you at that
Well,
time?
obviously, I was the beneficiary of decades of really good uh, commanders. Not all of them were perfect, but I was lucky I benefited from some very good commanders who had been veterans or had so much experience, let's say. And I also was surrounded by really good sergeants, and so many of the NCOs have been killed in Vietnam. So the ones that have survived had some real life experiences to pass on. And I was smart enough to realize that, number one, I was never the smartest guy in the room, and number two, that if I listened to the NCOs, sergeants, they could probably save me from myself, but that I was still responsible, if it went bad. So these are the kind of that was the culture I grew up in, and I started off in West Germany in 1981. I reported to my first unit. It was a mechanized infantry battalion up in West Germany, and I was very lucky because this was right at the beginning of the Reagan buildup. So there was huge emphasis to rebuild the Army, emphasis on training, and my battalion commander had served in Vietnam 3 different tours. He had commanded 3 different companies in combat, and I mean the guy was. You could imagine how hard he was, how focused he was on readiness. And so I spent 3 years in West Germany, knowing that the huge Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact were just across the border. And so we were focused on readiness all the time. You didn't go home on Friday if you had a vehicle in the motor pool that was still broken down. That was the mindset, the culture, fight tonight. And so that set me on for the rest of my Army life. It was all about readiness. Are soldiers properly trained? Do we have the systems in place? And then finally, the importance of working with allies, because obviously we were surrounded by German, British, and other allied forces there.
The post-Vietnam Army, I mean, it must have been quite a hill to climb it because of what happened and the politics and the drug use and the sort of views that happened. But it was rebuilt, and it was rebuilt. I think some senior leaders really took it upon themselves to rebuild the army, so that by the time in the early '90s when you're going to war in Iraq, I think we had built obviously the best military in the world. But I think it took a lot of effort to get there. I mean, so did you feel that? Were there leaders that are trying to change the culture? Because I think we're going to end up having to do some rebuilding possibly after this period.
You're exactly right. I had a former commander tell me one time. He said, "Ben, 3 things saved the U.S. Army after Vietnam." And I thought he was going to say, the Abrams tank, the Bradley fighting vehicle, the Apache, and it was none of it was equipment oriented. He said 3 things. Number 1 was the creation of the National Training Center. And the NTC out in the desert at Fort Irwin is where you go and you just get hammered with your unit because it's a competitive environment, not like the old traditional exercises that are so
Like a red
rehearsed.
and blue thing, right?
Yes. And the dreaded Op 4, they live there, so they do this all the time. They cheat like hell, and so Blue 4 gets hammered until you finally learn to do things, how to fight, as So it was the creation of a training environment that was realistic, very demanding. Everybody talks about doing tough training. NTC was hell. And that was a critical part of helping us learn how to fight again. The second part of this goes hand in hand with it was the institutionalization of the AAR, the After Action Review. This seems kind of pedestrian, but the After Action Review, which you had to do after every event at the National Training Center, and then it became part and parcel of the entire Army. This is critical self-reflection. What happened? Why did it happen? How do you fix it? And so commanders would have to start off themselves like, well, I probably didn't give clear orders about this, or I didn't understand this. And it really did so much to improve the with the not just the integrity, but the professional integrity of how we look at ourselves and to evaluate. So that was essential. And then
In
the
that
third,
process, I think aren't junior officers enlisted allowed to like speak up and what happened to them, even
yes,
with their so like everybody has a place, right? It's not
that
just rank based. And that
you have to do it. The best AERs will probably be where some sergeant said, "I never knew we were supposed to do this," and then you realize, okay, the orders did not get transmitted clearly, or whatever. The third thing was the establishment of a non-commissioned officer education system, where, as the Army began to realize, we have to decentralize more. It can't be all top down. And so if we're going to put more responsibility on sergeants, then we need to give them the educational opportunities so that they're prepared. And I've never forgotten those three things, because they really were all about people leadership.
yeah, culture changes. And changing culture is hard, but doing it. So, but also in that time, and I don't know if it would have affected someone who was sort of working their way up in the Army, isn't the Goldwater reforms and the purple and moving the different Army, Navy, everybody was sort of closer together. Did that have an effect that you saw in your
Yes,
career?
absolutely. The Goldwater-Nichols Act was the law enacted because the Congress realized that the services were never going to become joint. I mean, we talk about it, but we were never truly going to become joint. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines were all, fighting for their share of the budget pie. And, this sounds worse than it was, but nonetheless, we were not optimizing all the capabilities. And so the Congress said, all right, well, we're going to make you do it. And so if you want to become a general, you have to have served in certain joint assignments, and you have to have certain joint education requirements. Well, that tells the Army, okay, if you want Hodges to ever be a general, I better start making sure he's getting these assignments and education along the way. And so, of course, then the joint force, the joint staff became the dominant part of the services. And then the services had to fulfill their Title X responsibility of the Army provide trained and equipped land forces. Same for the Air Force and Navy and so on. So yes, I mean, that was what I grew up in. And it forced the services to think more joint.
Right. I mean, the professionalism. So, I mean, a lot of retired military leaders prefer to stay silent on sort of political matters and what's happening now. And what compelled you to speak publicly when you believed that norms or institutions were at risk? And what do you hope Americans understand better about military service and national defense in this day and age?
That oath, my oath to the Constitution, which I started way back when I was a cadet, and then have continued it up through my service. I retired in 2018 after 38 years as an officer. Uh, I never believed or even thought about whether or not my oath would still be in effect or not. I mean, it didn't have okay, you're retired, you have nothing to do with the Constitution anymore. I assumed the opposite. And so when I see that it is in danger, of course, I'm trying to think, okay, how can I help defend it? Now, one of the things we have done in the services, or certainly in my experience in the Army, was every time a soldier or somebody was promoted at the ceremony, you would reaffirm the oath. So everybody hears it being reaffirmed. Whenever an enlisted soldier would re-enlist for another 2, 3, 6 years, whatever, affirm the oath. And then you just constantly are reminding people so that it's in the fiber of who you are. And retaining the respect of our fellow citizens is important because, number one, they have given the military the authority to use lethal force to defend the state. So that respect is important. Plus, if you're an all-volunteer force, parents and influencers need to be confident that the military is based on legal activities or legal framework, and it's an institution that can be trusted. So these were important. That's why I kept doing it. But now, more recently, of course, I'm not surprised that the current administration is just tramples all over the Constitution in so many different ways. I'm not surprised. I am surprised how quiet others have been. I'm a retired 3-star. Nobody except my mother could ever believe I made that. But the fact is, it's the 4 stars that are the real power. I mean, they have the real authoritative voice. And I think these guys, these men and women, should be speaking out much more to protect the ones in uniform, the 4 stars in uniform now, because they can't and they shouldn't be speaking out publicly. But it would be very useful if former chairmen, former Army chiefs, for example, were speaking out about what's going on, about the improper use of the military. I think, and then, after that Quantico gathering, I've been reflecting on Quantico a lot lately after this Caribbean boat strike incident. And of course, they're throwing the admiral under the bus. If this happened, he would have been in the chain and he would bear responsibility. But the fact is, it was the secretary. You remember, he talked to everybody. He said, you exist to break things and kill people. Now, in his mind, he thought he was giving a real good locker room speech, to a room full of hundreds of admirals and generals. But so that's setting a culture. You exist to break things and kill people. And then he said, no more woke rules of engagement. And I'm listening to that and I'm like, I can't believe what I'm hearing, because clearly he doesn't understand what rules of engagement are about.
I mean, I think we have an obligation. I mean, I worked in CIA, it's a secret organization, and both of our organizations are actually large, complex, huge responsibility, lots of moving parts. I think we have it was in the CIA, it was, I think, really General Hayden when he came from the military and brought some of the discipline that he had learned growing up through the joint military to say, American citizens don't need to understand what we do. Like, we can't tell them the secret stuff we do. That's not part of it. But they need to understand we work on behalf of them, and to the extent that we can tell them the things we do and how we do it so that they're more comfortable with what we're doing, we should do that. And I think that even goes further when we see threats to things that are happening to us now and threats to the system. I think the military, the intelligence community, the law enforcement community, the federal law enforcement community are gems. I mean, I think the public, if they got to sit in our meetings, sit in day by day, the decisions, the kind of hard things that people are doing around the world, they would be proud of what we do. And it hurts to see that thing just used for whatever today's political football is. And it weakens those professionals, and they fire a lot of the senior people who they think are threats to them, who aren't threats to them. I mean, when you work in the military or CIA or in the government, you work on something for a couple of years and then you're moved on to something else by your leadership. And they're taking and saying, oh, General Hodges, you worked under General Milley, therefore we can't trust you. Like, well, what do you mean? Like, I worked under lots of people at different times, lots of presidents and things. So I think it's an obligation we have, and it's a tough time because you get attacked for these things, but it needs to be done.
Well, and this is why I think it's important that the retired guys, and I would say probably the same in your community as well, can speak out, because you can speak out in a way and explain why these administration policies and the way they're doing things, why it is detrimental to the United States. We see over and over now, our allies their intelligence services are saying, not so sure that we can share, and you would know better than me how much we depend on foreign intelligence to piece things together. And I think you don't have to be political to recognize that this is a danger to the United States. It's not going to be an American satellite that identifies a terrorist attack that's coming. It's going to be somebody in 2 or 3 different foreign intelligence services that are talking to their American counterparts saying, hey, watch this.
Yeah, let's talk more about allies? Obviously, one of your senior jobs is working in Europe, and you live in Europe and you work with allies. And your point about intelligence is true. I think in the clandestine service where I work, the bulk by far of the information we got was from partners, and not always partners that are just Five Eyes allies. Like, I worked in Indonesia and in Pakistan, and we got information from them that saved American lives by building relationships and professionalism over time. And so, like, to throw those allies under the bus on the intelligence side, I see the danger of that. Tell me your experience. How important is it that the U.S. has friends and allies around the world? And
So we don't have enough capacity to do everything that's needed. When I became the commander of U.S. Army Europe in 2014, I had followed 2 or 3 superb officers who had all tried to stop the reduction of capabilities in Europe. I mean, the last 2 heavy brigades went home like in 2008, 2009, something like that. So we had no American tanks in Europe for the first time since 1944. And so, but it's like, we don't need that anymore. And then the decision was to bring home the Apaches. We don't need that anymore. Of course, this is right about the time that Putin started, doing what he was doing. But anyway, so I had to find help from allies. We didn't have enough bridging, so we started working with the British and German engineer units. My chief of staff was the German officer because the Army wouldn't even resource the brigadier to be the chief of staff because we were so low in priority. So you start looking for people that, who can you trust, who can you depend on. And so the air defense, the American unit that's in Poland right now as part of NATO's enhanced forward presence, is in fact a Romanian air defense battery. We just don't have enough. So we have to depend on allies. The problem will be if they, and I'm going to connect this back to the Quantico and our legal framework, you can be sure that some of our allies will be reluctant to put their soldiers under American command if they see that there are no rules of engagement that are part of this.
yeah, I agree. And take it one step further. We'll talk about a couple of the things that have happened recently. But do you see that that's going to affect the military itself and its ability to recruit and retain people, its readiness? Do you worry about the working with allies that the administration is pushing against it? It's going to affect us for the long term?
Well, we have air bases, naval facilities, land facilities in UK, Spain, Italy, Greece, Turkey, obviously Germany, Poland, all over Europe that help us. We're not, those forces, those bases are not to defend the Netherlands or to defend Germany. They are there as platforms for American strategic power projection into Africa, the Middle East, but also our contribution to NATO's collective defense. The number of American troops, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines that are in Europe is less than 100,000. It's like 95,000. That would not even fill up the University of Michigan's football stadium. So we're not talking about a lot of people, but these are bases that when you fly or sail or deploy to Europe to go somewhere else, it helps us. It's to our advantage. And you just can't take that for granted that European countries will always say, yeah, no problem. You can have your headquarters or your maintenance or your training areas or your seaports, use our seaports. That's because of decades of trust and investment by us and those allies. So this is more than just 2%. They should be paying more. And by the way, almost all of them are by now.
Yeah, that's right. Tell me a little bit. You're there in Europe and you travel around and you meet leaders. And I'm going to ask you about your experience with Russia, Ukraine, and those things in a minute. But how do you see that Europe is responding to this moment? They're seeing from Washington less engagement, even some nervousness that we might not have the backing of NATO like we may have had. We're obviously seeing more inclined towards Russia, but the war is going on in Ukraine. And there's pressure on Europe to maybe change their defense strategies, either individually or as a group. What is it you're learning? What are you seeing? How are they handling it? And are you optimistic about their ability to defend themselves?
I am cautiously optimistic. What we're seeing is in several countries a recognition that they have taken it easy too long. They hid behind the U.S., or many of them hid behind Germany, because Germany was not doing its part, and so they were able to stay out of the glare from the White House because the Germans were taking all the heat. But it kind of depends on where you are. Finland has this enormous border with Russia, and only a population of 5 million, but they have more artillery than any other country in Europe. They have a mobilization system that they practice all the time, and that they can put 200,000 troops in the field in 2 weeks. All the troops that are already trained and equipped and have their weapons. So the Finns have never been confused. Poland obviously has moved out very quickly to improve their own defensive capabilities. They now have the largest tank force in all of Europe. Other countries are doing better, but not as well as they should. I would say the Nordic countries, especially Norway,
closer to Russia, seem to get it better.
Well, the geography is a big part of it. Exactly right. You have a history, and you can feel the threat. The Estonians also not confused, but Germany has really taken some important steps over the past year. They no longer argue about whether or not to grow the size of the army. Now it's, how do we do it? Do we go back to conscription, or can we recruit enough? That sort of thing. So that's a completely different argument. Money is not a problem. They have changed their laws to allow them to do what we do, which is to, go into debt to modernize and grow your defensive capabilities. So you can feel it changing in that regard. But still, you've got so much Russian penetration into parts of Europe. In many European countries, even if the government is not a right-wing government, the biggest political party in the country is a right-wing party. So like AfD in Germany, Marine Le Pen in France, you've got in Slovakia, Fico. So these guys are a problem. And the Russians have poured money in there. Reform Party in UK, for example, as well. So this is something that's got to be addressed internally if the Allies are going to come together and recognize that Russia really is the threat. Now, there was a meeting, a phone call between President Macron of France, the German Bundeskanzler Merz, the Finnish President Stubb, and some others, Rutte, Secretary General of NATO, and they were talking about how concerned they are about Ukraine. And one of them said, and of course the reason I know this is because it was leaked and Der Spiegel published it. One of them said, we have got to help Macron. We have got to help Zelensky. We've got to protect him from these guys. And they're talking about Witkoff, Kushner, and Trump, not the Russians, because they see, unfortunately, they see that the U.S. is not. The U.S. is focused on the U.S. and transaction and getting to business with Russia, and that Europe and Ukraine, as a part of Europe, is going to have to fend for itself by and large. And they see this now. And so this is going to accelerate what they're trying to do.
So you were in Europe in a command position 2014 and on, after when Russia took the Crimea, and these problems started to reach the height that within 2022, the second sort of invasion of Ukraine by the Russians. What is your experience there in terms of working with the Europeans to understand that threat, starting to work with the Ukrainians to the extent we could? Give us a little bit of your experience as a commander on the ground during that period.
Well, of course, there were an awful lot of people in different nations, smart, well-educated, responsible people that were like, come on, Russia is no way are they going to do what became what we now refer to as the large-scale invasion. They're never going to do this. It would be so stupid. They would be screwing themselves economically, for example. That was a common mindset from countries in Central and Western Europe. The countries in Eastern Europe they knew what was coming, but the rest of them, not so much. Germans were still building Nord Stream 2 deep into 2021, until just a few months before Russia's large scale. The Germans were still building Nord Stream 2. So that was unfortunately a mindset. Now, we had started working with Ukrainians back in 2015. We got the mission to help them as they were dealing with Russia's initial invasion in 2014 to help them. But the policy was still, helmets and blankets and night vision goggles and first aid kits, but there was no lethal aid. This was during the Obama administration. And, we didn't have a policy. We didn't know what the hell we were doing for sure. So my task was to create a training center somewhere in Western Ukraine. And we used an old Soviet training area called Yavoriv, which is outside the city of Lviv, and began to turn it into a training center, not just a big range. And we immediately began to realize that, wow, these guys have real experience. I mean, they've all been under Russian artillery fire, rocket fire, drones, electronic warfare, stuff that we had not faced. And so I remember asking one of my NCOs who had been out there with them for a few weeks, and this is a typical paratrooper, a guy from the airborne tends to have a slightly higher degree perception of himself than maybe the average soldier does. So they're very cocky and confident. And this guy had probably been in Afghanistan and Iraq like 6 times. I said, so what do you think? He said, sir, these dudes are not Iraqis. And of course, what he was saying is they are committed. They already have experience. And so we started learning from them. And actually, we changed our training model. Remember what I said earlier about how training centers save the Army? So we changed our training center at Hohenfels, Germany, from something that was about security, cooperation, and assistance to the OPT-4 is going to have all the capabilities that the Russians do: long-range precision strike, massive amounts of rockets, electronic warfare, drones, so that now our troops had to compete in that training cauldron, if you will. Otherwise, they would never get better. And then General Milley, who was the chief of the Army at the time, he came and saw that. And then he directed the same thing happen at the training center back in the States, because that's where you change. And that was all because we started learning from the Ukrainians.
I think that's an important thing, is that not having the arrogance to think we can answer every question. I mean, the Ukrainians have been facing the Russians obviously for forever and decades, but even since 2014, constant misinformation, constant disinformation, constant covert attacks, constant efforts to cyber attacks, and then obviously military attacks and low-level military attacks even before the invasion. And so I think that's, the military and all of our institutions needed to learn and change and learn and change. And I think this arrogance that, we need to be the center of everything and tell people what to do is a potential problem for us.
That's a great point, John. I always thought the best organizations were learning organizations, that you have a culture of how do I get better? And of course that means you have to acknowledge that you screwed something up first, or that a mistake was made. And you also have to have a culture that tolerates that, unless it was a mistake of willful negligence. But these have always, my experience, these were always the best outfits.
Let's take that idea and put it to right now. Like, one of the things as we're talking, the issue has been this attack on supposed drug boats in the Caribbean. And as we speak, the discussion is the Secretary of Defense talking about telling to kill everybody in the boat. So even after they've taken the first strike and there's people in the water who are no longer a direct threat, can you shoot and kill those people? So that's the issue we're dealing with now. And that suggests to me this arrogant attitude, because essentially the way they respond to it when this comes out is, nope, we did nothing wrong. And then Hegg talks about when he used the signal chat to talk about attacks with the Houthis in Yemen. Nope, did nothing wrong. There's nothing we do wrong. Blame others. Do you worry that learning capability of the military might be under threat because of sort of political pressures from on top?
Well, yes, because if you're in an environment where questioning of orders or pushback on stupid policies or maybe even unlawful policies is, if that's part of the culture, then, and also if you see a lot of people getting sacked without cause, you know, that change, that's a culture change, or that creates a climate where, number one, you don't want to raise your head above the parapet. And also there will be really good people who know that they should not or cannot obey an unlawful order, but they're also trying to protect their soldiers, because if they're gone, then they'll find somebody who will do it. And so I think probably a lot of good people are dealing with, I'm sure of it, are dealing with this right now. Do I go or do I stay and try to fight back? I think that and so far, I guess at least what we've read from the admiral who was the Southcom commander, and then he resigned, or he left, and now we know that he was told by Hegseth, you're on the team or you're out. And so after a few months of this kind of contentious relationship, the admiral was told to leave. So it's not always as simple as, screw you, I'm not doing that. It's that you have, and you, by the way, while
you
everybody
try to
knows,
make it work. You try to help people understand the seriousness of what you're dealing with. Everyone's trying to make it work. They're not like, I think people think there's a partisanship in our institutions where we're just trying to work against whatever political leader we have if we don't like them. And that's just not the case.
opposite. It's the opposite. Yeah. We are a mission-oriented institution like you were. How do I get it done? I remember being told when I was young, you will never have all the resources you need. Never. But you will always be expected to still accomplish the mission. So you're going to have to figure it out. And so that's our mindset. And if you've got a situation where the secretary, especially at that level, is saying we're going to do this and this and this, of course, what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs should be doing, and the service chiefs and the secretary's inner circle should be saying, Mr. Secretary, I know what you're trying to accomplish. How about if we do this? Because, it's also inappropriate. You don't want uniforms out in public humiliating the civilian leadership. I mean, that's also ingrained civilian leadership over the military. But you have to have the backbone to do this behind closed doors and say, this is bullshit. This is illegal. We can't do that. We absolutely are not going to do that. And then they say, thanks for your service. There's the door. Okay, now, we're in a different situation. And this is why the retirees I've talked about are so important, and also the Congress. I mean, hopefully hearings will expose some of these things in such a way that most people watching it will say, okay, this is not partisan, this is legitimate. And I think this is an important part of it.
Yeah, there's legal ways to meet the mission, to support policies.
Exactly.
So you've been really generous with your time. So I'll just ask a couple of sort of more personal questions as we move on here. One is, what message would you give to young officers entering this deeply polarized political environment?
Well, when you enter the military, and I imagine it's the same in your professional community as well, you've got so much work to do that you don't need to be worrying about what's happening way up at the top. You accomplish your mission, and you take care of the men and women, uniform and civilian, under your responsibility. You focus on those two things, and not only is it fun, it is so rewarding. You're doing something. You're going to be learning. You're going to be so impressed with all the fellow Americans that you meet. So I encourage people who are asking, I don't know if I want my daughter to go in the Army now or the Air Force or whatever. I said, hell yeah, get in there. This is not going to last forever, but we're going to need quality women and men to serve forever.
No, I think that's right, and I hope that that's right. I hope the damage isn't making its way down that deep. There are very, very serious people, very serious professionals in these organizations. And again, if the American citizens can see what we're doing every day, they'd be proud of it. So one last sort of final reflection, if you could leave the listeners with sort of one idea about the relationship between military professionalism, good governance, and national unity, what would it be? How do you see the military in a modern political space?
I think we have to be a rules-based, constitutionally loyal institution that nobody ever questions whether or not we are going to carry out lawful orders, and we're going to do our best, and we're going to make sure that not only do we always accomplish the mission, but that we're going to do it in a way that doesn't waste the life of a single man or woman in uniform. I like what Colin Powell used to say. He goes, "I'm not interested in a fair fight. We're going to do overwhelming everything that they need to accomplish mission. We don't want a fair fight with any enemy." But I would say the thing that has been missing for so long is our civilian leadership has to clearly identify the strategic objective. What is it we're trying to accomplish? We didn't have it in Afghanistan. We didn't have it in Iraq. Did not have it in Vietnam. Not really. And so right now, we don't have a strategic objective with regards to Ukraine. What are we trying to accomplish? And if you do that, then you can develop the right policies. But if you don't have a clear objective, it's very difficult to develop the right policies.
No, I agree with that. Thank you very much. So General Hodges, thank you for your time. I think it's enlightening, and that we really appreciate. Not we, me as an American citizen appreciates what you're doing and speaking on, and in fact, helping the Europeans deal with this difficult time. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
John, thank you. I'm really grateful for the privilege.
Thank you for listening to the Steady State Sentinel podcast. Don't miss out on more insights and exposés from America's premier global security experts.
Also, subscribe to our Substack at substack.com/@steadystate1 and follow our social media, and join us right here next week for another exciting edition.
The Steady State is a nonprofit organization working to sustain our democracy and national security.
Join us and support our mission by visiting www.thesteadystate.org.